You asked and Imperial listened. Due to extreme popularity and brewer demand, the A44 Kveik blend is being released as a year-round available strain. This blend of 3 proprietary Kveik strains absolutely loves hot fermentations, producing beers bursting with fruity notes of pineapple, guava, and tropical flavors. Use it for your summer blonde ales, your hazy IPA, or anything else you want to have a delectable fruity fermentation character. And A44 is absolutely perfect for those who may not have the ability to precisely control fermentation temperatures. Just pitch your pouch and let her rip. Pick up your homebrew pouch wherever Imperial Yeast is sold and place commercial orders at imperialyeast.com. Ask any brewer how to pack the hoppiest punch into an IPA, and they'll almost certainly talk about dry hopping, which is the process of adding hops to beer at some point during fermentation. Once added, the dry hops usually take some time to fully integrate into the beer and can even be forced by the natural movement of fermentation back into solution, at least when they're added directly to beer without a restrictive barrier. You're listening to the Brewlosophy Podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and joining me on this episode to chat about the impact of using a dry hop filter, particularly one made of stainless steel mesh, is contributor Brian Hall.
It's been a long time since I've chatted with you. I'm excited to talk about this because one of my biggest pet peeves in brewing is anything that gets clogged. And so these have been something that's been very helpful for me in the process. But like you, I've probably wondered what happens when you pack a bunch of hops into a small amount of area.
Absolutely.
If they actually are able to get around and flavor the entire beer or just a small portion of it.
Yeah, I've actually gone back and forth on my own approach to dry hopping, at times tossing the hops straight into the beer all willy-nilly while using some form of a filter at other times. My reasoning for filtering dry hops today, which I do pretty regularly, is definitely different than what it was when I first started brewing IPA. We are going to be getting into that, as well as the results of a fascinating experiment that Brian performed later in this episode. All right, if you're a fan of this show and you'd like to receive a reward for your support, consider becoming a patron of Brewlosophy over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy. By making a small monthly pledge, you'll receive rewards like access to unpublished contributor recipes, unique discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invite to a monthly live Q&A session with someone in the brewing world. Coming up later this month is Noah Bissell from the famed Bissell Brothers Brewing out of Portland, Maine, known really for their excellent hazy IPA. Brian, were they around when you were living in Maine?
Yeah, they were they just started up, I think, third year I was there, and I was good friends with one of my buddies, David, who is actually the founder of Good Fire Brewing Company, also in Portland, Maine, and he was neighbors with Noah Bissell, and so we were getting all sorts of substance packed into our daily lives. It was great beer.
Yeah, he's such a cool guy, too. He's going to be spending an hour taking questions from patrons on Sunday, May 31st, 2020, so make sure to make your pledge at patreon.com/Brewlosophy by May 30th. All past guests have included folks like Mitch Steele, Mary Izette, and John Palmer, and all of those past sessions are available for patrons to watch whenever they like on our private Facebook page. Another really easy way to support us is by using the links found at brewlosophy.com/support. When you're doing your online shopping, your experience doesn't change at all, and we get a little kickback for the referral. All right, feedback is brought to you by Brewers Hardware, who specialize in triclover compatible sanitary fittings, conical fermenters, kettles, and brew stands. Brewers Hardware offers a variety of unique items for home and craft brewers, including high-quality stainless fittings at great prices with super fast shipping. Learn more at brewershardware.com, and don't forget to mention Brewlosophy when you're checking out to receive a free gift. Again, that's brewershardware.com. Listener Dave Hickling, whom I believe is from the UK, had a comment on our recent episode about reusing yeast from a high OG batch to ferment a lower OG beer. He said, "Not the cheapest hobby. Brewing is quite literally one of the only hobbies where you can save money. I know some people like to spend a fortune on elaborate systems, but my setup cost me less than 200 pounds, was pretty easy to build, and I've used it for at least 7 years, made about 2,000 liters of beer for a fraction of the price that commercial beers would have cost me."
Wow, that sounds like a pretty good deal. I think I'm off by a couple orders of magnitude on that one.
A lot of people commented on this comment, actually, and were like, well, you know, if you factor in the constant purchasing or upgrading of equipment and kind of geeking out on it, yeah, it might take a while to recover, you know, the investment, I suppose. But I actually kind of understand Dave's sentiment with the whole thing. You know, I sort of believe, you know, I like the saying, careers are for making money, money while hobbies are for wasting it. But I feel like if you really are into the saving the money side of homebrewing, it's not that difficult to do. I mean, I calculated out, I think Tiny Bottom Pale Ale 3 or 4 years ago cost me like 26 cents per pint to brew it, right? And
wow.
I don't know if I factored in the cost of gas and energy and such, but even with that in, it's still going to be less than $1 a pint. For a bottle, you're paying something like $1.50 for 12.
Right. I think it totally depends what kind of beers you make. When I was making all those barrel aged sour beers in Maine, I could knock out a 55-gallon barrel of beer for $150.
Yeah,
and that's everything included. Whereas you look at the bottle price of some of those, and I'm not saying I was making $30 a bottle of beers, but that's what they cost. And so if I could drink that instead at 30 cents a bottle, it's a great deal.
Yeah, and the thing is, on top of that, there's value added in the fact that you had a good time making it, and that you get the whole DIY experience. So I really do appreciate Dave's feedback. And I think the reason he made this comment in regards to that episode is because we were talking about, the whole saving money by reusing yeast. So, but anyways, thanks for the feedback, Dave. If you have show feedback, you can send it to feedback@brewlosophy.com or drop us a note on social media. One of the fun parts of running this podcast, and I love this piece of it, is that listeners often offer to send me beer, not just stuff they've made, but commercial beers they think are really great and they want me to try. Well, a few months ago, I got a package from James Bywater, who's from Salt Lake City, Utah, that included a can of local to him, I believe you say Kiitos, it's spelled Kiitos, brewing. Their second anniversary ale was included in this package. And it's described as being a blend of Imperial Red, barley wine, and Imperial Stout, all three of which were aged in barrels.
1 minute beer review with Jersey and Tim. We're not gonna drink it anymore. What is this?
I don't know. It's dark.
It's dark.
It's got a weird smell.
Some things that smell gross taste delicious.
It's not that.
Do better. Do better.
It's a little rough for me. It's very rough.
Okay, well, what is it?
I don't know.
Well, it's beer, right?
I don't know if it's beer or not.
What could it be? Oh my God. Okay, I'm gonna take a sip.
I think it's a barley wine.
Oh God, it's actually either really good or really bad.
Yes.
I would agree with you that it might be a barley wine.
I wouldn't say it's bad. It's just bad for me.
What? I think it's a barley wine. Is it a barley wine?
I think so too.
Do we have the courage to call this a barley wine?
I already called it that.
How about if we call it a barley fline?
Fline?
Yeah.
That would be fline.
Now let's rate it as a barley fline.
It's not so fline to me.
I actually kind of like it.
Well, good.
Timmy, I like it. You don't like it?
I actually don't.
Can you tell me why you don't like it?
Probably not.
Can you try?
It has like a grape-ish.
Oh my.
It's not good.
I like this because it tastes like ethers and phenols and stuff.
I think the pH is off.
Timmy, let's take one more sip. Come on, for posterity.
Take another one?
That Timmy doesn't like this means a couple things.
Not much.
You're so learned you don't even know it.
Right.
It means that it's a very it's a fringe beer. You like beers that are easily identifiable. I like this a lot, and I know this is going to confuse you, but Timmy, you and I have very different styles. This one's not in your wheelhouse.
Not at all.
And I wouldn't have thought this would be mine, but I really, really like this. It's smooth. It's smooth.
It is smooth.
And the flavor that you get for this type that we, of course, know, but we're not going to say it out loud, is easygoing. It's easygoing. Dude, I would drink another glass of this. I'll give it at least 5 jerseys.
All right. I'll go 3. I've had a lot worse.
Well, Timmy's appreciation for bigger beer styles is a bit hit or miss. And to be honest, I was kind of surprised he didn't like this one more than he did. I personally thought the beer was fantastic. It had like a nice, that blend of toasty, rich, kind of like crusty toast with a bit of roast in the background. Just, and absolutely delicious barrel character, which I think you'd expect from 3 barrel-aged beers. I couldn't drink a ton of it, but it was an excellent sipping beer in my opinion.
Sounds great. I've never had it, never heard of it, but I love those big, strong beers. They're just so filling, which I thoroughly enjoy. I know you're on the other end of the spectrum. You like to be able to consume multiple pints. I mean, I'm happy with one big thick one I can stick a fork up in.
Well, this one definitely made me think of you. I know that you really appreciate the bigger, richer, beers. out there. But yeah, Keto's. I've never heard of that brewery, so I was kind of excited to try something from a brewery that is new to me, but also is kicking ass, doing great stuff. So good job. Thanks for sending the beer in, James. If you'd like to have your beer or any other fermented beverage you feel like sending in, reviewed by Jersey and Tim, you can email me, marshall@brewlosophy.com, and we'll get you all set up. All right, we'll be right back after this break. Have you ever thought about adding a port to your kettle but held off because you didn't feel like drilling into your gear or sending it off to have someone else do it? From the makers of the world's fastest counterflow chiller, the Xchillerator, comes the Hangover, the easiest way to add extra ports to your kettle as well as countless other options. Mount a faucet to your keg for easy portable pouring. Set up the perfect whirlpool arm. Hold a heating element in place. All of this and so much more without permanently modifying your gear. Manufactured right here in the United States, the Hangover offers brewers too many convenient solutions to list here. So head over to xchillerator.com today to see what the Hangover can do for you. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts. Craftmaster Growlers takes traveling with and sharing beer to a new level. Made from heavy-duty stainless steel, Craftmaster Growlers are double-wall insulated and can keep beer cold for up to 8 hours. Unlike typical growlers, Craftmaster Growlers come with a swiveling tap and fully integrated CO2 regulator cap, allowing beer to stay fresh for 2 weeks or more. The square design takes up less space and will fit in most refrigerator doors, and every Craftmaster Growler comes with a 1-year warranty. There are 64 and 128-ounce versions available over at craftmastergrowlers.com. The brew in a bag method has blown up over the last few years, and in that time, it's become very clear that not all bags are created equal. For the best BIAV experience, you have got to go with the Brew Bag. Made from high-quality, food-safe polyester, the Brew Bag is available in both 210 micron for standard brew in a bag, as well as 400 micron, which works beautifully for all-in-one recirculating systems. I've been a Brew Bag user for years and wouldn't brew without it. Head over to brewinabag.com to get the fabric filter that works for you and use promo code TBP17 at checkout to receive a discount. Again, that's brewinabag.com. Adding a dry hop charge is important to achieving the aromas and flavors expected in IPA. It's so important, in fact, that it's a method I think brewers use as a matter of course when they're making that style. Now, on the commercial scale, at least as far as I'm aware, this is typically done by tossing a bunch of hops, either pellets or whole cones, directly into the fermenting beer. I'm not personally aware of many brewers, commercial brewers out there who are, filtering their dry hops. However, many home brewers prefer to do just that when they're adding their dry hops to beer.
Right. I think the only thing, going back to your idea comment on the pros that I've heard of them using something for is when they're adding adjuncts, like if they're adding coffee or vanilla beans or something like that. But yeah, everybody else, I think they're just letting it sit and settle out. I think part of the reason that they don't have to worry about it as much is simply they have larger tubing, larger everything, as they say, and they don't have to worry about the clogging issue, which I think is the number one reason why people are containing their hops in some sort of canister or bag. Yeah,
I can speak to my own personal experience. I didn't start dry hopping beer, probably for 2 or 3 years after I started brewing. And the reason is back in 2003, when I made my first IPA, and that I'm using that term loosely at this point, it was all about packing as much bitterness as you can. At least that's what I remember. I was 22 years old, and everybody just wanted to prove how strong they were in their ability to drink really bitter beer. And so the first IPA I made was exactly that. It had like 130 IBU, and I didn't add any dry hops to it. And so 3 or 4 years later, I'm getting into it, and you're hearing people talk about you don't want to clog any of your. At the time, I was using a racking cane, which are very easy to clog, and so it was just kind of the norm for me and for the people that I knew who were homebrewing, to bag your dry hops. And I remember thinking one time, I had a dry hop bag that was really green and gross. And I thought, man, it's probably not the safest bet at this point to use this bag anymore. And so I went, I had to dry hop this beer. I didn't have time to wait for a bag, and I dry hopped them loose. And lo and behold, it worked out just fine, so.
Right. I'm right there with you. I mean, when I was brewing after the first year or so, it's like the cold side was kind of just an afterthought. It was like, all right, we've got the fermentation going. We'll throw in some dry hops. We'll rack it using this thing. There was no thought of the suck back or the oxidation or any of those sorts of things. It was just, oh yeah, I'm brewing, and then I've tossed my yeast, and then we'll kind of deal with this and package it later. So there wasn't really that consideration. Infection wasn't really something that was on the front page of the circles that I was going in. This was all kind of before I hopped on the internet in my brewing career. But as time has gone on, we've kind of upgraded our fermentation, or at least I've upgraded my fermentation vessels. We're using different things, and when we're doing a lot of these forced transfers, we need to figure out a way to have them happen without packing in particulate and other stuff, which when you're making beers that are using 4, 5, 6, 8 ounces of dry hops, whether it's a single or a double dry hop pitch, you're going to run into those issues if you're not containing them somehow. Yeah. Especially with some of the small dip tubes that we're seeing on some of these fermenters these days. So I went to this stainless canister, which is, I think it's 10 inches by 3 inches, or maybe 2.5, something like that. And that was after having used several bags like yourself that ended up with different colors that were not exactly what I wanted. So I decided to go to stainless.
Yeah, and I think that's a valid point, or valid decision, I suppose. Like any decision in brewing is valid, but I did the same thing. I started off using bags, and it wasn't until I think 2.5 years ago that I started seeing these stainless like hop. People call them hop spiders when they're used in the kettle, but they're basically the same thing, and they don't hang off the side of your fermenter. You just drop it straight in. I was talking to some brewers recently, though. When I realized we were going to be talking about this on the show, I kind of surveyed my local homebrew crew, a couple of the people that I'm aware of, to ask if they're still filtering their dry hops, and a lot of them still are. And when I asked their reasons, it's interesting because back in the old days, I think most people would have, old days like 12 years ago, most people would have responded with, well, that's just what you do. I mean, that seemed to be a lot of the reasoning back then when I first got started. But now some of the reasons that these guys told me were pretty interesting. One of them that I liked was, if you're double dry hopping, which is something you mentioned earlier, Brian, you can actually add hops and then more easily remove those hops from the beer before adding a second dose. And that goes to reduce this worry, I suppose. And some of us question whether this is actually a thing, but to reduce the risk of imparting that kind of grassy chlorophyll flavor. Some people are concerned if you leave hops in contact with beer for too long. So that's kind of one of the benefits, I suppose, if you're doing that type of a dry hopping schedule and you want to get that first charge out of there.
Sure. Yeah. I think there's a lot of different benefits to using the stainless canisters personally. I think the most debatable thing that people have an issue with is whether you're oxidizing the beer when you're adding the canister in, and then whether there is some sort of issue in the containment of hops when they aren't able to free range throughout the beer, that you might be getting a less of an extraction.
Sure. Yeah, that seems to me the biggest concern that I've read about. In fact, I just did a quick Google search, and somebody recently on a popular homebrewing forum was asking what are the perils of filtering your dry hop charge, and somebody immediately responded that less efficient extraction of the oils and such. Again, this is why we wanted to test it out. Another good reason that I heard of for you want to reduce the clogging, But if you use let's say you don't have the ability to cold crash, which we know drops that hop particulate out along with a lot of other stuff and makes racking over to a bottling bucket or your keg a ton easier if you're using a racking cane. One of the people that I was talking to earlier this week was telling me that they have the opposite experience, and I've actually shared this experience where when you cold crash in a fermentation vessel that has a valve at the bottom, it actually can compact high enough to be over that valve, and especially if you're using a dip tube. And so I get clogs doing a cold crash process. And so by containing those hops, you're not adding to the trube pile, basically.
Right. That makes sense. I've found that if I take that little racking arm and just twist it to the side or up sometimes, that can kind of get it out of that pile of joy. But I know you and I think Ray or Jake or somebody, they've actually removed the little racking arm that's in there.
Yeah.
So I guess at that point you don't have anything. The other thing that's nice about the stainless that I like, other than not having a reactive issue with the beer, is that you don't have to add any weights to it or anything like that. You can just fill it with hops and drop it and it just sinks. Yeah. It's a small thing, but it's really nice to do.
I love that piece of it as well.
Yeah, it works really well in the keg, for doing, I call it a micro dose, but sometimes if I want to kind of bring a beer back to life, I can just put in like a half ounce of dry hops and add it to the keg.
Yeah.
And it can give a little boost to it. So
the time at which I went and purchased a couple of my own stainless steel dry hop filters. First off, it was because you had been talking about them and using them for your experiments. And I thought they just looked really convenient compared to cheap bags, and they're not that expensive. But I had actually brewed in one of my SS Brewtech, one of the stainless brew buckets with the valve on the bottom. Like you said, this is also the point where I was like, screw the dip tube. I don't need it, whatever. Because during this time I had that dip tube pointed almost all the way up, and I just made a hoppy IPA, may have even been a New England IPA, to try it out, try my hand at it. And that thing clogged so badly with as much hops that I threw in there, with, again, unfiltered, just tossed them in loose, that even multiple attempts at trying to unclog it by like pushing CO2 through the valve, it would just clog up right away. Anyways, I ended up having to use a racking cane for it.
So I'm going to interrupt you right there super fast for everybody that's listening with a racking arm, and just throw out a little tidbit that I learned from SS, is that you want to ferment with that thing to the side. Because if you are fermenting and you have it tilted up and then everything crashes out and falls down, it's just going to fill right up.
Yeah.
Whereas if you have it to the side, it doesn't fill as much because you've got that opening pointed tangentially. All right, the more you know. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, it's 100%. That goes for any fermenter that has a bottom valve with a dip tube. 100%. You want to ferment with it totally sideways, and then you can move it around. That's the beauty of these things. You can move them prior to racking. But yeah, that thing clogged like crazy. And I pushed CO2 through it 4 or 5 times. Finally, just went and got my old stainless racking cane and ended up getting the beer off of the tube that way. But since I went and picked up one of these stainless mesh screens, I personally haven't had any clogs when I don't dry hop that often, but I haven't had any clogs, haven't had any issues. Like you said, I removed my dip tube and I'm still not having issues clogging the port, at the bottom. And to me, I haven't noticed much of a difference or any difference really in the character of the beer. One of the arguments against using these things is that there's concern that some of those hop oils, when you're adding your dry hops, will stick to that mesh screen and not go into the beer. And so, and again, this is the less efficient extraction argument, is that, well, if you add these hops to this container, the stuff has to seep through that very fine mesh, and some is going to stick to it, and you're not going to get as hoppy of a beer.
Yeah, I've heard the argument about the lack of flow going in and out of the canister because
Right.
you don't have a lot of those convection currents like you would find in a boil kettle. I've never heard the argument in the fermenter about the hop oil sticking. I would assume they would just get washed away at some point, but
well, I think it's safe to say that it's not people out there, and maybe there are people saying this who like preaching don't filter your dry hops because of this. I think as homebrewers are wont to do, there's just some concern that it might not be the best way to do it. Until your experiment, I had never done a comparison. I just used it out of convenience, which to me is so valuable. It makes cleanup easier. There's a lot of good benefits to it. If you want to harvest yeast, you're harvesting pretty much hop-free yeast from the bottom of your fermentation vessel. So to me, it just seems like a win-win. But then again, maybe it is having some sort of impact on extraction of those hop oils and thus reducing the hoppy character of the beer. Another concern, and this is one that I personally have had, is that the quality of a lot of these mesh screens may not necessarily be too high. And when that happens with metal, it can lead to downstream issues such as metallic flavors in beer. At least that's a concern of mine if you don't wash it properly, or perhaps if it starts to rust in little spots.
Yeah, I haven't had a rust issue. I've had about 8 of these floating around my brewery for the last couple of years now. I've purchased a couple from Amazon. I've purchased a couple from Adventures in Homebrewing. I've purchased some from Alibaba Express, and all of them have different qualities, and as helpful as it is, different threading on the top.
Yeah, God.
But I haven't had any rust issues. Haven't noticed anything metallic coming out of the beer. I'm assuming that they're all stainless steel. But other than the quality issues, I haven't noticed any flavor issues that have affected anything. But one of the things that I think is important and that we kind of go over is how many hops to put in one of these.
Definitely. I think that's probably one of the bigger considerations, considering the fact a lot of these tubes, like you said, I think the one I have is 11 inches by 3 inches. So, you think of hop pellets, you could pack in probably 8 ounces of pellets into that cylinder, but in doing that, you are restricting their ability to absorb the beer and inflate, right?
There is the threshold I've found that I usually stop at is 3 ounces, and even then, sometimes these things come back and they've just expanded like one of those little pellet toys that you throw in the bathtub that turns into a giant sponge dinosaur or something like that. It's just they stretch out so much.
Yeah.
At one point I think I did 5 ounces in one, and when I opened it up, the middle was still dry.
I've got the same story. I did a beer where I packed something like 200 grams, 7 ounces, into a filter, into one of those things, just thinking, man, there's so much room left in there. And 6 days later, when I racked the beer over to a keg and I'm cleaning everything up, there was a nice dry core with like whole pellets still right in the center of the thing.
And that's why I have so many. I mean, the advantage of the brew bucket is being able to just pop the lid off and dump as almost as many of those as you want in. So what I do is, even if I'm only doing a single dry hop charge, I will put in about 2.5 ounces in each of the canisters and add them in, instead of trying to put in 5 ounces in one, because I feel like I get more contact. The concern that I have that kind of goes back to our idea of oxidation is every time I dump one of those in as gently as I possibly can, I feel like it's kind of the same. I feel like I'm kind of slightly aerating the beer, because in the same way that you push water through the aerator in your sink, I feel like that mesh is just creating all these little sites for oxygen to come in as you drop it in, or bringing in a little bit with it, as opposed to a smooth-sided container that would just slide in so delicately.
That is one of my concerns, regardless of how I'm dry hopping, and I don't think you can avoid oxygen exposure when you're doing it. I do feel like that's probably one of the reasons you're seeing a lot of brewers these days who are adding dry hops, during active fermentation, even if it's towards the end. As long as you got those few points left, we're told that yeast will metabolize the oxygen so that it doesn't negatively impact the flavor of the beer. I have to agree, though. There's something about the mesh filters, how fine of a mesh that is, that it just feels like every time I drop it in, I'm like, God, that's so many places for oxygen to touch this beer. I don't dry hop that often. In my experience, I have been moving, when I do dry hop, I have been moving the point at which I add the hops to the beer closer and closer to yeast pitch. Not necessarily, New England IPA at high Kreuzen, but I'll certainly I've started adding dry hop charges, 4 days into fermentation, with maybe when there's like a day or two left to finish things out. And I haven't noticed in doing that I see a big increase in oxidation in my beers. So,
well, that's good. I can't say I've noticed anything huge different, but I also used to just brew in a carboy with a racking cane and had fine beers then too. So
yeah, I know.
All this fancy shiny equipment. What's changed?
To get back to the just real quick a comment. So you were talking about how all the different places that you've purchased your these hop canisters from, these stainless mesh filters. I can't say I've had 3. So I only ever ferment 2 batches at a time. And so there's a reason that one of them I ended up throwing away, and I still keep 2 on hand. And it was because I noticed little bits of rust around where the top connects to the mesh. So the opening portion of it, there was just this little bit of rust. And when I went to smell it, it smelled like metal. And the other ones didn't do that, you know? And so to me, that was definitely, like I mentioned, that was my bigger concern in terms of a negative impact on flavor that doesn't come from, less hop extraction or whatever it is. So I say that only because if you're going to go out and purchase these things, which I'd recommend you do if you want to filter your dry hops, they're great. Maybe consider your source, though it's possible everyone's getting their, these things from the same place. I don't know.
Yeah, I have no knowledge of where they came from. I just knew I needed some more, and so I just bought them cheap.
Yeah, no, I got mine from Amazon. They're everywhere on Amazon. I think I got 2 I found a 2-pack, and it was like $18, so $9 a piece, basically.
Right.
Yeah.
So the other interesting thing that I had read previously when putting together this experiment, and part of the reason that I was curious about it is I had been doing a lot of research into dry hopping methods. And I did used to use a version in a keg where the beer would be transferred into the keg, and then dry hops would be added to the keg, and there would be a stainless mesh filter that would go over the dip tube. Mm-hmm. And you can actually use these. You can use these hop canisters if you drill I think it's a 3/8 hole in the top. You can shove a dip tube in the top, and you can do something. It's kind of the reversed canister, if you will, where all the hops are on the outside and you're now pulling the beer from the inside. That allows you to have your hops kind of free range around the beer. And kind of part of the motivation of that is there was a study done by Hopsteiner where they found that dry hopping in a finely woven bag did actually reduce the amount of amount of compounds in terms of, I think they studied alpha acids and not geraniol.
Linalool. Yeah, I know what you're talking about. Scott wrote about it, I believe, in his new book.
That's where it was. Yeah. And so I think it was like 50% less linalool in solution, and alpha acids was like, I don't know, it was even more than that.
Yeah.
But so there is some data out there that does show that there is less of these around. Now, I haven't seen any other studies being done. Frankly, I don't think there's many people in the industry that are doing these sorts of things.
Right.
Right. As we mentioned earlier, so there's probably not the need for it. But I did think it was kind of an interesting point that, the experiment showed one thing, which we'll get to in a minute, and we've also kind of got this other objective data as well.
Well, and I think it stands to be discussed the fact that you can't extrapolate. It's easy to look at that Hopsteiner study, which is great, but you can't extrapolate from it because a bag was used as opposed to stainless. Now, everybody knows that there are multiple ways you can filter your hops in beer. I think most commonly, in the beginning at least, were muslin bags or some sort of a nylon or voile type of bag. But they're nowadays with these stainless ones, and I believe that Hopsteiner study was with fabric. It wasn't with stainless mesh. So, it's easy to say, to look at those results and say, if you filter your hops, you're going to see a decrease in these things, rather than if you filter them with the very material that was studied. And so I think it's just important to point that out, that it could be a function of the material that was used as opposed to the actual filtration of the dry hop charge.
Yeah, I mean, I personally think it's probably has to do more with a filtration than an actual material issue.
Sure.
But, you're talking containment so much as I think it's more of I don't know how to explain it.
I get the again, we're not going to focus too much on this study, but I think it's interesting. If you take a muslin bag and you take a stainless filter and you put both of those in water and then you pull both of them out, there will be more water absorbed by that muslin bag than by the stainless doesn't absorb anything. And so it makes more sense to me that you might have reduced, efficiency using some form of a fabric. And just as an aside, we have tested this and there will be a show on it at some time in the future, I'm sure.
Right. But the amount that you're talking about is minuscule compared to...
Presumably. I mean, who knows? The fact that Hopsteiner found this, though, I do find very interesting. And all in all, despite our positive experiences filtering dry hops with stainless mesh, you, Brian, were curious to explore the impact doing so actually has on beer character, and you put it to the test. Results from that experiment when we're back from this break. After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste more time chilling wort. I've tried so many different options, and ultimately I settled on the super efficient immersion chillers made by Jaded Brewing. With the King Cobra and Hydra, I'm able to chill my entire batch of wort from boiling to just a few degrees above groundwater temperature in as little as 6 minutes. If an immersion chiller is right for your brewery, then do yourself a favor and check out all of the rad options Jaded Brewing has to offer at jadedbrewing.com. And be sure to let them know Brewlosophy sent you.
Compact and simple to use with a small footprint for brewing indoors, the Grainfather makes it easy for you to brew professional quality beers at home. The Grainfather is an all-in-one brewing system that lets you brew all-grain beer in a single, compact stainless steel unit. It uses an electric heating element and pump to maintain a constant temperature and to circulate the wort during the mashing and cooling stages. It also comes with a counterflow chiller to reduce chilling times and produce high-quality wort. And now, with the addition of their conical fermenter, the Grainfather takes things one step further by offering homebrewers state-of-the-art temperature-controlled fermentation just like commercial breweries use. And with the Grainfather Recipe Creator and Connect app, you can easily design a recipe, sync your brewing system with your phone, and then just sit back and relax as the app takes over and assures that you maintain your scheduled mash temps and boil schedule. Head to Grainfather.com to purchase your all-in-one brewing system today and to sign up for their free recipe creator tool. Once more, head on over to Grainfather.com, that's Grainfather.com, and get started today.
Family-owned Atlantic Brew Supply is the largest homebrew shop in the Southeast. No gimmicks, no multinational corporate overlords, and no BS. They offer exclusive malts, yeast, and more from local artisans, as well as award-winning recipe kits. They also sell professional brewing gear and cask equipment from sister companies ABS Commercial and Cask Supply. Most ingredients are available by the ounce, plus Atlantic Brew Supply has an on-site calculator to help you craft your best brew. Orders are processed same day, and 2-day shipping is guaranteed for East Coast customers. Get 15% off your first order using promo code BREWPOD. That's BRUPOD at AtlanticBrewSupply.com. Like I mentioned before, I don't brew very much IPA, which means I don't dry hop that often. But when I do, I want to make sure that I'm getting the most out of those hops as possible. At this point, I've probably used a stainless mesh filter when dry hopping more than I haven't. Is it reducing hop character in my beer or having some other impact? That's exactly what you aim to find out, Brian.
Yeah, so I decided to make a 55-gallon batch of beer.
A 55-gallon batch of beer in your garage.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's not so much the size, but it is convenient to try a bunch of different things at once. Sometimes I can experiment, sometimes I can do blah, blah, blah. Yeah, anyhow. So I decided to put this to the test, making an IPA that it's kind of a hybrid between West and East, just because the water profile is more of an East Coast style. The malt bill is more of a West Coast style. I don't remember exactly where the IBUs, I guess, were calculated at West Coast, but I will say that most of the calculations done on my New England IPAs show up really high anyways. So,
yeah.
This definitely did not have a huge hop bitterness to it. So as I go through the recipe, just kind of keep that in mind, because it does sound like it's going to be crisp and blah, 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 but it's not. So I just used 88% pale malt and 12% crystal 10. Despite, I will say, I don't think crystal malt really belongs in an IPA. This did turn out fine. We mashed at 152 degrees Fahrenheit or 67 degrees Celsius for 60 minutes. We boiled it for 60 minutes as well. I added 9 grams of Magnum CTZ Warrior at 60 minutes, 9 grams of Amarillo, Centennial, and Simcoe at 30 minutes and at 5 minutes as well.
That is a lot of hops. I would have expected this to be pretty bitter, like you were saying as well. But I found when you're using the right kind of hops and you're putting them at the right spots in the boil, that it can really kind of restrain that bitterness. But
I'm not adding a ton. I mean, I've got an ounce at 60 minutes, an ounce at 30 minutes, and then an ounce at 5 minutes. So there's really not a lot compared to the giant dry hop that we're going to talk about here in a second. So boiled for my 60 minutes, chilled it down, took the refractometer reading. It showed up at a nice 1070, so a little bit stronger than most of the ones that I usually make. Racked 5.5 gallons to two separate brew buckets and let them finish chilling in the cooler of my garage. I used a little bit of wort and I made a vitality starter, which has kind of been my favorite thing lately, with some 090 San Diego super yeast, and pitched that the following morning. The beers were fermented in my garage at about 66 degrees, give or take a few degrees, for 2 days before introducing the dry hops. So we talked about a huge dry hop charge. I added 113 grams, which is about 4 ounces of both Amarillo and Simcoe, giving us a total of 226 grams or 8 ounces total. So I added directly to one batch and split it evenly between 2 stainless mesh filters for the other. And you can see right there that I'm already going above what I recommend, both in terms of dry hopping and in terms of what you would want to put inside of a hop canister.
So tell us more about that, because I've heard that 4 ounces is about ideal for these hop canisters.
I found that 2.5 to 3 ounces is my sweet spot, just because at 4 ounces, like when I pulled these out, they were just packed. I didn't have any dry spots, but I mean, they were definitely stuffed to the max. I've experienced that as well, which is why I went back down to 4 ounces and using that. But again, these things come in all shapes and sizes. Either way, your recommendation would be what, 2 to 3 ounces per canister? 2 to 3 ounces, which would be about 90 grams ish.
Yeah. So that's interesting. I'm probably going to heed that advice. But in the case of this experiment, you filled 2 different canisters, 4 ounces each, tossed them in, both of those into one batch, and then the other one you free hopped, if you will.
And again, I use 2 canisters, as I mentioned earlier, just to give the hops more of a chance to get to know the beer, as they say, but to be able to have more liquid going through the canister, because that's ultimately what we want.
Yeah, exactly. And so you left those beers alone for 12. Now, how long do you usually dry hop? That seems like a fairly long dry hop.
Well, part of it was I was out of town, but another part of it was I thought it would work out really well because, if there were any dry spots or if there was a circulation issue, this was going to give them more than enough time to get around and release any flavors or oils that they were going to do. There was going to be no they didn't have enough time to soak, but this would give them plenty of time to do that.
Yeah, that's I agree. 12 days I've done. I think the max I've done is 21, and I got to be honest, I didn't notice any negative impact. But I also think that for this experiment, that was pretty ideal because of the fact that we wanted to see if we're looking at whether the filtration aspect of it with a stainless mesh screen is going to impact it. So the longer they're in there together, I think I don't know. To me, it feels like you're kind of emphasizing the point here.
It was that, and I was in Hawaii for 11 days, so it worked out really well.
That to me is always the reason I make decisions to extend certain parts of a batch.
Yeah, part of it is we're brewing beer. It's a hobby, so I do have it work around my lifestyle.
Yeah, it's got to.
So after letting them sit for a perfect 12 days, they were racked to kegs that I had filled with Star San and purged out with CO2. And then I put them on gas and let them sit for another week before I serve them to tasters. Usually I find that the sweet spot for me is about a week out after kegging. Some wines have bottle shock as they're transferred to the wine. I call it keg shock. But anyhow, so they looked exactly the same. I did triangle tests and wasn't able to figure anything out for myself.
Yeah, and I was reading your impressions on that, and it seemed like they were identical to you. These beers tasted exactly the same, which on that anecdotal level kind of starts to give you the idea that, hey, these beers or the filtration using a stainless mesh had no perceptible impact. Obviously, you went and served these to 25 people who had no clue what the variable was.
Right. 25 people took the triangle test. 13 would be expected to show a significance and an actual result. Only 5 people, so 20%, only 20% were able to tell these beers or guessed at telling these beers apart. So, and we didn't do any preference data because of such results.
They're the same exact beer, basically. I mean, 5 people out of 25, that's 20%. You'd expect 33% if it was random guessing. So even below that, and that's just the nature of statistics. But that I guess on some level for me, as somebody who has filtered using various materials and preferring the stainless one, this was pretty validating to know that you can pack in even 4 ounces into the canisters, which you think is a bit too much. And still get the same quality dry hop character as dry hopping loosely. I think that's a good thing. And the fact that it goes against the study that Hopsteiner did, which I think is a great study, makes me wonder, one, if it's not the material thing, but also if there isn't some sort of like a objectively measurable difference in something like linalool levels, or but that just maybe we don't perceive that,
Right. I mean, there's also the idea in my mind was that I added 8 ounces of dry hops, and we've talked about a supposed dry hop saturation point of being about, I think it's 4.5 or 5 ounces per batch. So it's possible that we reached the saturation even though there wasn't as much contact between all of the hops and the actual beer, because if you got 8 ounces packed in there, but really our saturation point is 5 ounces, then three of those ounces might not even need to make contact for there to be a full saturation for both.
Right. Yeah. Effectively don't matter. Right. They're not doing what we're expecting them to do if we reach that saturation point. I had the same thought, and it makes me it makes me wonder if you were to pack, say, 7 ounces like I did and have that dry core, compared to another one that reaches that saturation by that 8 grams per liter or whatever it is. If you wouldn't be able to get the same character, if it does reach that point, and then stops contributing hoppy goodness. I don't know. I think it's fascinating.
Well, that's supposedly that people are even able to take a triangle test and be able to determine the difference between 2 ounces and 4 ounces in a dry hop. Because if people can't even do that, then it doesn't matter whether you're getting that full contact or not. Yeah, no, I'm with you. I think it's interesting. So because of these results, are you changing your ways? I'm going to go ahead and guess that you're probably still going to filter your dry hops most of the time. Yeah, I mean, I'll probably filter them just because it's kind of the only option I have at this point, unless I want to end up with a clogged fermenter, which is just the worst. Yeah, I hate it too. If I was going to do a bigger beer, I'd be comfortable adding 4 of these canisters in if I was going to try and do like a double dry hop of 5 ounces each or something ridiculous like that. So it's pretty much having them in some sort of contained vessel is pretty much the only way that I found to dry hop in one of the fermenters that has some smaller opening, and then you've got the small opening on the fermenter, but then it's also got to make it into the keg post, which has an even smaller opening. So I think those are probably the only option for somebody that's trying to do that type of massive dry hopping. Yeah. So there are sometimes, very, very occasionally, where I'll make something like a cream ale or a simple blonde ale. And for fun, I just want to add just a little whisper of dry hop character. So I'll use something like 1 or 2 ounces. In those cases, I probably won't filter my dry hops using one of these stainless mesh screens. Just toss them in loose, only because I don't think, even after cold crashing, that's enough to get in the way of my valve. Pretty much anything over 2 ounces, though, these days, I'm a stainless mesh hop filter user. I love these things. They're cheap, with that one exception of the slight bit of rust that I found on one of them. I've had nothing but a positive experience. Again, if anybody wants to go and buy one of these things, they're available pretty much anywhere nowadays. They're pretty cheap. Just make sure you check it out when you get it, because I don't fully trust the quality from all of the manufacturers. I'll just kind of leave it at that. I think sometimes they whip these things together and may not take all the precautions. So, but just make sure you take a look at it and wash it good. How do you clean yours anyways? Do you do I imagine you do like a sanitizer soak before you use them, but. Yeah. I will often, I mean, if I'm washing them, I usually either soak them in PBW, or if I'm doing like a big gear wash, sometimes I actually use the pressure washer that I use on my driveway.
Yeah.
And it just blasts everything off of them really fast.
Yeah.
Sometimes I'll sanitize them, and to be honest, sometimes I don't. Sometimes I'll just drop them in. I like to live dangerously, I guess. But
Yeah, you're nuts.
I mean, it's like, why not?
Yeah. I mean, hey, to each their own. What I do is I clean it off. I have a hose attached to my, just a small bit of hose attached to my utility sink faucet. And so I can kind of squeeze the front of it and create some pressure. So I'll clean it off that way. Scrub it with like a bottle brush, anyone who's had kids knows what I'm talking about. Kind of get the insides with that, and then let it air dry. And then I'll soak it in sanitizer for a good 15 minutes before I toss the hops in there and toss it into the beer. So, and that's exactly what I'll keep doing again for any dry hop over 2 ounces. All right. We do have some reader comments I'd like to get to. First one comes from Mark Buster, who says, this is a topic I've wondered about. I use stainless hop spiders in the boil and a hop canister in the keg, but I've never actually contained the hops during the dry hop. Honestly, I find myself doing less dry hopping and more keg hopping in general these days, but this is good info.
Yeah, I use them for keg hopping. I use them for fruiting for my sour beers. The concept of this quote microdose, I'll use that to kind of bring back some life into any beer that I want to add fruit or hops or spices or anything like that. They are really nice, as you mentioned earlier, to be able to remove if you've already hit that peak flavor. So if you're trying to make that perfect pumpkin spice beer for this fall, hit it with that cinnamon for a week or two, and then pull it on out when you hit your spice level. I only say that because I just did that with a pumpkin spice beer.
Yeah. Oh, they're definitely a multitasking piece of gear, I think. Unlike Mark, I've actually never keg hopped. I don't think I have. And so to me, I like the idea that you mentioned of if you're going to dry hop in a keg, I would be more inclined to punch a small hole, in the bottom of one of these dry hop canisters, put my dip tube into that so that the opening is towards the bottom of the keg and hops won't leak in through that. And then just dry hop the beer loosely. And as as you're pulling that beer off the keg, those hops are just floating around loose. I don't know. Maybe it doesn't make a difference at all, but I like that idea. I think Greg Foster used to do that actually years ago. So we're not the first to talk about it.
Yeah. The only thing I found with the keg hopping is when you do put them in, if you leave them in there till the keg is drained, towards the end, I do get that kind of grassy flavor that it's not quite as bright. So, people will tie on little bits of flat floss to the end of these things, then run it out. And if you've got a tight seal, you won't be losing any gas out the top, and then you can just pull it out with the floss. I've never done that because I just drop it in and drink it really fast, but or just I make sure it's something that I want to leave.
Yeah,
but
I think it was Ed Coffey recently actually who had mentioned to me or somewhere online that he he prefers the floss method because it allows you to pull the hops out as that beer continues to drop in the keg. And so you're not, you kind of, it's same idea as we talked about earlier about being able to remove the one dry hop charge once it gets to that peak hop character that you're looking for, and then you can add another one or whatever. So yeah, good comment though, Mark. Michael Cadillac says, great article. So how did you go about filtering the loose hop batch in the end? Because fuck clogging.
Oh, that's right. I remember this one now. I got really pissed about that.
That's right.
It did clog, and I just let it drain as slow as it could. I put it under. Not as slow as I could, as slow as it did. I put it under about a pound of pressure, which is enough to make the top of the brew bucket just lift up ever so slightly. But I just left it, let it sit for a long time. Probably wasted a lot of gas. Because dialing in 1 psi is not something I'm really great at.
It's difficult,
on a 30-pound scale or something. It's just, I don't know. I just think about it makes me upset. It just makes things slow down. I don't do slow very well. I just like the things to boom, be done.
I'm the same way. Yeah.
Yeah. So I just put it under a little bit of pressure. I had to connect it, disconnect it. Sometimes the hose clogs, so I put on some nitrile gloves, dunk my hands in sanitizer, and I continuously have to clear the thing out, put it back, so on and so forth. It's a real pain in the butt. I mean, even you said 2 ounces is your threshold. I just will never probably ever add hops loose unless I figure out a way to put like a screen over the dip tube
Right.
or something else like that. It's just such a hassle.
Yeah, I mean, I do think there's an element of humor in the fact that, in the experiment testing hop filtration, which you do because you hate clogs, the one that you didn't filter got massively clogged.
Well, yeah, if you get 8 ounces of hops in the thing, it's like, what do you expect? You notice there is a picture of it being done. Yeah, I mean, that's probably like the picture. Yeah, I remember that. That's the picture of it, the good one happening, because the one on the right was a goddamn mess.
Well, so to answer Michael's question, though, you didn't filter the hops. I mean, that was the whole point, right? So you just dealt.
Yeah, they weren't filtered. It was like the 45-minute transfer.
Yeah. God, I've been there, man. I hate it so much. So, and that's why, again, you and I both are dry hop filterers, if you will. All right. Joe says, really cool article. 2 questions. Was there a noticeable difference in the 2 packaged volumes? And do you think you could have harvested the yeast from the filtered batch without too much hop material coming over?
I didn't measure the difference, but when you're racking 5 gallons of beer, if there's a pint left in one versus the other, it's not something that I really ever think about.
Yeah.
Retrospect, if for the people out there that are genuinely curious, that are trying to preserve every pint, would have been a good thing to check at, but you still got the absorption happening in one versus the other. The only difference there is that with the mesh canisters, I think you can get a little bit lower on the liquid level because there isn't a bunch of shit floating around in there. And whereas the one that's got 8 ounces in it, yeah, there's going to be some issues.
I think the packaged volume thing, that's another thing. I don't think we hit too much on that some people will say about using a hop filter that I've read, and the argument goes both ways. Which is funny to me. That's homebrewing, I suppose. But I've heard people claim that when you keep those dry hops in a canister, that absorbs and it holds on to all of that beer, and you could lose up to a pint or two, pint and a half or so of beer. Whereas when you throw them in loosely and they pack down into the trube, they're not absorbing as much beer. So I get the question. My hunch would be that in your kegging, you would have noticed if there was a major difference, a noticeable difference in the volume that you ended up packaging, and that you never mentioned that to any of us. So I'm kind of wont to believe that it likely wasn't a big deal, or big enough for you to notice at the very least. So anyways, reusing that yeast with all of that dry hop material in it, what are your thoughts on that?
I'd probably just run it through a strainer, to be honest with you. I've got ones that have tighter mesh than those dry hop canisters. If I was going to reuse it, I would just run it through one of those and then go from there.
I've never even heard of that, but it makes total sense. Yeast, especially as you thin it out, maybe run some distilled water over it in the strainer. You'd probably, keep all of the hot material back and get mostly yeast. I would, if I wanted to reuse it, I would just reuse the yeast with all the hoppy stuff in it. And I say that because I've done it. I've done it quite a few times. In fact, I'll pull out like a pint of yeast slurry, regardless of whether there's gelatin in it or hops in it. And I've pitched it into a really simple blonde ale type of beer, and it's not like the beer tasted any more hoppy than I intended it to taste. So I guess that's just one of those things that wouldn't concern me. You are 100% going to, if you're just taking yeast slurry, going to have a bunch of hops in it, though. I mean, that's just unavoidable.
Right. I mean, especially if you're doing 8 ounces.
Yeah, exactly.
you're gonna have a lot of material in there. I would just run it through as fine a strainer as you can. If it's not flowing fast enough, add a little bit of distilled water to it. Yeah. And then let that settle out and go off the top.
Yeah. Or do the whole, what everyone used to do 8 years ago, which is rinse their yeast after using it. That'll take care of it as well. So, All right. Next comment comes from Reddit user Keg Starter. He says, he or she says, I have the same mesh filters. I use them for dry hopping, and now I used to use them for dry hopping. I apologize. Now I just toss in loose hops, and then put a stainless mesh around my auto siphon when I transfer. No more clogs. I believe this is what Scott Janish recommended on his blog and perhaps in the book as well.
Scott Janish recommended putting it over the dip tube, I think was his favorite method, with a stopper on the top. So you've actually got it inside the keg floating around. Right. Yeah, if you've got a carboy that you're using that with, you can slide over the top. I've done that numerous times. I'm just not fermenting in a carboy anymore. That is another thing we didn't go over earlier, is kind of one other con to these hop filters, is that they don't fit inside of a carboy. So you do need something with a wide mouth to be able to fit them in. But yeah, if you're unable to do that, one of those sleeves, I think There's a site out there that makes them in custom sizes that does fit over any sort of siphon. They work wonderfully for filtering those sorts of things. I use them for fruit, for all the sours, for anything that I'm adding into a carboy or a container where I am unable to put it inside. Or, sometimes if you're adding 5 or 8 pounds of fruit, you don't really have an option of putting it into a canister. So, the only other option is to let it flow around freely and then put your siphon inside of something else. So, that is a great alternative if you need to have your product being going through one of these filters before you transfer it.
Yeah. No, I think it's a genius idea. Super simple too. In fact, it made me think of, there was it must have been 7 years ago now. Somebody like sent me a link to this. It was before I had seen these bigger hop canisters that a lot of us are using now. Back then I was just using 6-gallon PET carboy. So I would never have been able to fit one of these in there anyways. But somebody sent me a link to this one that they saw that was probably, 15 to 18 inches long and just slender enough to fit into most carboys. And I thought, wow, it's a perfect way to filter dry hops, pull them out, and then you could rack the beer over. And I tried that with like 4 ounces of dry hops, and it was tall enough to where the lip of the filter kind of butted up against the lip of the carboy, so it didn't drop into the beer. Those things absorbed so much that they were kind of spilling out of the top of this thing. There was no top on it. So the hops ended up going into most of the beer anyways. But what I discovered was if I dry hop loose and then I take this filter, I still have the thing, and drop it, sanitize it and drop it down in there before racking the beer out of the carboy. It was like ideal filtration. It worked so well.
Sounds like a good option.
Yeah, it sounds like exactly what this keg starter is talking about. So yeah, it worked for me. All right, Travis Jensen, our last comment, he says, you heat your hot liquor with a sous vide machine. Does that take a long time when you're working with the 5-gallon batches? If it's efficient enough, that seems like a nice savings on propane and more accurate mash temps. I include this because after this article published, I think we probably got 50 comments on the fact that we included a photo of you heating your strike water with a sous vide machine. So have at it, Brian.
Yeah, I mean, it works great. I usually use a hot rod. I think you can see, if you look at that picture in the upper left-hand corner, there is the GFCI outlet for my hot rod, and that's plugged into the other kettle that I've got there heating up water. So it's just, I wanted to have more water going. The hot rod will heat up 55 gallons overnight to about 170 degrees. Mm-hmm. The sous vide will I set it to 185 just because I like having a little extra hot water, and then I kind of even everything out in the morning. Mm-hmm. But it's also got a 900 or I'm trying to remember, one of the ones I have has 900 watts. The other one I think is 1800 watts. And they'll heat up the water just fine. It just takes a long time.
Yeah.
The advantage of the sous vide is it does circulate the water.
Yeah.
I found that if I come into the hot rod in a 50-gallon kettle, the bottom is actually still cool, whereas the top water is quite warm. Mm-hmm. So I'll have to stir that, but it works very well. Especially if you're trying to nail a specific temperature that you want to have when you walk into your brewery in the morning.
Yeah. I never actually used my Anova sous vide. I think we have the same one, which I do believe is 900 watts. I never used it for heating strike water because, like you, I had a hot rod, and the hot rod is just a 1500 watt, 120 volt heat stick that is really well constructed. And what I would do is I put it on a smart plug. So I bought like a $15 smart plug on Amazon, plugged my hot rod into that, and then I would set a timer for it to turn on at 4 a.m. if I was planning to go out there at 7 o'clock to start brewing. And it'd click on. I'm not doing 55-gallon batches. These would be for 5 or 10-gallon batches, and my water would be perfectly heated, with my cup of coffee in hand. So it reduced the time of my brew day by 45 minutes or so, 45 minutes to an hour. That part where you're heating your strike water. So it is a really cool and viable option. I highly recommend it. Well, Brian, that does bring us to the end of this episode. One thing I want to note yet again is that we have done basically this same experiment using a fabric bag instead of a stainless mesh filter. We will be getting to that at some point in the show. We'll probably put some space in between it, so we're not talking about the same thing twice too soon. But I know that there will be people out there wondering, so we have done it. You can go and check out that experiment on the website. Brian, anything else you want to add before we get going?
No, if that's about it.
Right on, man. Well, like you, I absolutely hate clogs. So if you hate clogs, go get yourself a stainless mesh filter. It doesn't seem to have much of an impact on the perceptible characteristics of beer. All right, you can read about this experiment by clicking the link to the article on brewlosophy.com in the description of this episode. The Brewlosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brewlosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brewlosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey, cause it soothes my throat. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman, no.